Thanks for coming. This session is a remote blob storage deep dive. It's going to be primarily focused on the Microsoft FILESTREAM and RBS implementation. The original session was supposed to implement a custom provider. Unfortunately, with all the issues, the presenter for that isn't here, and he was bringing that with him, so I'm without that, unfortunately. But I can go through the full implementation of the Microsoft FILESTREAM and RBS provider, and we'll demo implementing that as part of the presentation. So, just to ask a quick question, has anyone heavily used RBS before, or was familiar with the EBS, external blob storage capabilities, or implemented it, or any SQL DBAs that have used RBS before? Okay, so we're all going to learn something new then today, hopefully. So my name's Neil Hodgkinson. It's my fourth time on stage this week. I'm a senior field engineer for Microsoft, and I'm an MCM on SharePoint 2007 and an instructor for Enterprise Search on the MCM 2010 program. Twitter, I noticed I've picked up 107 new Twitter followers in the last 3 days, which is kind of interesting. So you want to follow me on Twitter, and I'll follow you back generally. Our email, if you've got any questions after the session, or we have a Premier Field Engineering blog, which the whole team tends to blog on for various aspects of custom support issues, which you might find quite useful. And I'm suspecting, from what I know about RBS, and now what I don't know about RBS, we're going to see a lot of support issues with RBS going forward. So just to cover what the session's all about then, I'm going to cover a little bit about SharePoint externalization. So we're not going to go back far, we're going to go back one version and talk about the implementation that was in place for the 2007 incarnation of the product. Cover the framework components, so what's actually in the RBS framework that allows us to use it and allows us to externalize data for SharePoint. The flow of data, how do we get information from the web front end into the database, or from the web front end through the database or APIs into the file system. Talk a little bit about required resources. There's some confusion about what versions of SQL you require, what versions are supported versus what versions it will work on. So we'll cover that both slightly at this point and also at the end. And then we'll actually do some installation configuration. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a demo walking through the installation, but I'm also going to do it first, step by step. The TechNet articles and the MSDN articles are amazingly misleading in terms of how you configure this. That's going to be rectified, but I just think it's important for two reasons. One, to get the information on the screen here so you get the right information, and it's the same scripts I used to build my system that I'm going to demo on, and it's working, which is amazing for me with my demos this week. The other thing is I've put it in the slide deck so you can use it as reference. So you'll all get a copy of the slide deck, so you can all use the scripts and take them from here rather than use the ones that have got some slight issues on the web. We're going to talk about migration. So, okay, we're going to enable RBS, but I've already got a huge file system full SharePoint system full of data. How do I get my data out of the SharePoint database onto the file system? And talk about some aspects about going backwards as well, going the other way around. I'll do a demo at that point. I'll try and do a demo at that point. And then we're going to talk about maintenance. So we always talk about SQL Server maintenance and maintaining of indexes. We're going to look at, well, what do we do in terms of maintenance for our blob stores, and what tooling do we have with the RBS provider to enable us to do that easier. And then a little look about scalable architecture. So there's a lot of information floating around about, well, why do we need to use RBS? What benefits do I get from RBS? When do I use it? When do I not use it? And the choices and the design decisions. So we're going to cover some of that off as well. So let's make a start. So in terms of the externalization background, sorry, I've got a sore throat today. The EBS provider that was available for SharePoint 2007, or Service Pack 1, was an absolute nightmare. I mean, I'm glad that no one in the audience said they implemented this. It was a horrible thing to work with. You had some real issues with orphan blobs, disconnected blobs in the BLOBstore. Cleanup of those orphans and cleanup of those blob was really, really painful. The whole thing, it doesn't say on the slide, but the whole thing was a farm-scoped externalization as well. There was no granularity involved, so it was like all or nothing. And then going forward, Microsoft isn't going to provide any guarantee of future support for the EBS API. So to all intents and purposes, it's now a deprecated API. With 2010, we get a much better story. So 2010 is great from the orphan's perspective because we have transactional integrity. When the external blob is being pushed into when the blob is being pushed into the external file store, at any one point within that process, any component is allowed to veto the transaction. If any one component vetoes a transaction because it fails for some reason or it fails integrity, the whole thing is backed out and transactional integrity is preserved without generating orphan blobs in the store that aren't connected to any items inside SharePoint. It's a much nicer implementation. We can also do updates. So the update process of allowing us to update a file within the BLOBstore by making a copy of the file, updating the transaction, and then replacing the file is much neater, much nicer. There's no disconnection there at all, so there's no risk of orphan aspects. The cleanup capability is much more significant in that when we run cleanup, so there's some cleanup tools we'll talk about later, the whole cleanup leverages the SQL infrastructure. So it's not a very intensive, time-wasting operation. More importantly, it's an online operation, whereas in EBS, it was an offline operation. So we can do the whole thing much nicer now. And it's transparent to the SharePoint API. So SharePoint really doesn't understand or really care what's actually happening with the RBS storage. We use an RBS provider layer to do all that for us. SharePoint, we just talk to the API as normal. And in terms of future support, it's the recommended best practice, or I'm not going to say best practice, it's the recommended approach for using externalized content. And one thing that's not to mention on any of the slides, and one thing I should really mention is the Microsoft FileStream and RBS provider only provides support for local storage. So you can only store the blobs on the same disk system that's mounted on the SQL Server. If you want to go off to an external store, out to a SAN or something else like that, you really need to be looking at an external third-party provider, of which there's a whole range of them. Several of them are outside there right now who can talk to you about that. So what's in the framework? We have this concept of the RBS add-in framework. So we have this little MSI that you can download and install. Be very wary when you use it. If you just double-click and run the thing, it'll configure a whole lot of default settings that SharePoint really doesn't like. So just be wary of that. We have a provider library, and it's the provider library and then in conjunction with the client library that really makes SharePoint not care where things are. SharePoint doesn't understand, there's no configuration of SharePoint to make this work. It's all done through this server and the client provider. Then in terms of what we actually have in the database, when we enable, I'll show you the database and the changes in the database shortly, but when we enable RBS capability in the database, we extend the schema. So we have a significantly large number of tables that are used to coordinate and orchestrate the movement of blobs, the referencing of blobs, whether we even use the BLOBstore or not. And that's a decision that can be taken at design time. And then in terms of the application itself, so from a SharePoint perspective, SharePoint will use the RBS client because it's talking to the client. SharePoint doesn't, like I said before, SharePoint doesn't care what's actually happening. It's the RBS client that's acting as a provider for this whole solution. And it just effectively sends data as it would normally, posting it into the SharePoint API or via the SharePoint API, which then abstracts off through the RBS provider to make a decision through the business logic, where do I put this blob? Simple as that. Sorry. So the process flow. Aspects that we have, BLOBstore is basically an on-disk file share. Okay? SQL Server, ContentDB, ConfigDB. Just to point out, using BLOBstore for ConfigDB is crazy and unsupported, and you really wouldn't want to use it for your admin ContentDB either. Not that you store anything in there anyway. So in terms of what we have on the box, we've got the SharePoint object model and inside the SharePoint web front end, the same as before. These are the new bits. So we have this RBS client library, and we have the BLOBstore provider library. And the way the process works, when there's a save request that goes in, first of all, there's some business logic that takes place to decide what I'm actually going to do with this thing. And the business logic can say, based on information that we provide for blob storage, to say, well, only store files of a certain size in the BLOBstore. And there's a trade-off between file size and performance in terms of what you would do at this point. And we'll talk about that later when we look at when wouldn't I use blobs or use BLOBstore. The save process goes through the client library to the provider store, and then from the provider store into the BLOBstore. So the blob is written out to disk. As a blob, it's not changed in any way. It's exactly the same file. If you open the whole thing up, you can go back and take the file back out again. Its name is changed, as you'd expect. Its extension is changed, but the file itself is not changed in any way. Okay? There's a blob ID that's returned all the way back to the SharePoint OM. And the blob ID is then written into the content DB. That's how we can maintain the reference between the item on the disk and the item and the reference to the item in the content database. And that same process then is returned back to the user to say successfully failed. And what I mentioned earlier about veto, if at any one point in all of these arrows, all of these phases, if any one point fails, the whole thing is preserves transaction integrity and backs itself out. So you don't end up with random bits of information lying around that just cause a nightmare. So things that you need to make this work. We support it it works and it's supported to use it for SharePoint Foundation. SQL Server 2008 R2, November CTP, or going forward R2, which I'm not sure if it's RTM'd yet. Mike, Matt, you know? No? Okay, it's imminent, whatever the RTM date is. And it's supported against any version. There is a caveat on one of the last slides, which I'll try and get a bit more information on. I've left it in because it was delivered by a SharePoint PM, a program manager for the SharePoint product group. So I wanted to leave it in the slide. I'll talk about it a bit later in terms of when we can and when we can't use RBS. But typically, we support RBS against any version of SQL 2008 R2, even SQL Express, and we'll come on to using it with SQL Express later. The FileStream RBS provider, there are various versions of it floating around on the internet. If you do a quick search on your favorite search engine, which is obviously Bing, you'll find that there are a number of versions of the RBS provider referenced all over the place. A lot of downloader, these kind of 2cows.net and all those kind of places have got this thing hosted in all kinds of different spaces. Make sure if you download it, you get the right version. If you get the wrong version, it won't work. Okay, which kind of stands to reason. So the link's there if you want to get the right version. How do we install it? So I'm going to show this through in the demo as well, but I just think it's important for reference that we get it all in here. So the first thing we need to do is configure the actual server to support FileStream. And one of the things that's not referenced when you look on MSDN and TechNet is it doesn't tell you which boxes to tick in here. Okay, it's very important you tick all three. If you don't tick all three, you'll prevent the SharePoint servers from talking to the BLOBstore directly. Instead, you'll have no connectivity, so the BLOBstore, you'll get the veto effect and you'll just fail. So we turn FileStream on for Transact SQL access to make SQL Server work with it. Then we enable the file I/O streaming access, and we enable the remote clients to have streaming access. Then the file I/O streaming access allows Windows to talk to BLOBstore. If that isn't turned on, nothing's going to work. Okay? The second one, to allow remote clients to talk to BLOBstore, enables SharePoint web front ends or other SharePoint servers that are in the farm to communicate to the BLOBstore directly without going through SQL Server. They can literally go straight to the file system. And then we get this Windows share name, which is how we provision that capability. So the share name is used, the web front ends will just communicate to the share name. When you turn this on, make sure the location that you then ultimately configure doesn't already exist, or you'll have some problems. When you enable this, the file system is provisioned automatically by the process, and the various ACLs are defined, provisioned at that time. Once we've turned FileStream on in terms of saying, okay, we're going to allow SQL to use it, and we're enabling it in Windows, the next thing we need to do is actually turn it on in SQL Server itself, in the instance of SQL Server that you're going to be working in. And you can do that in two ways. You can do it through using an SP configure store procedure to enable FileStream access level 2. Level 2 is the bit that allows the full access to the whole system. So you either get no access, local access, or local and remote. Number 2, local and remote. Or you can configure it here. If you look in the server properties in Management Studio, FileStream access level, full access enabled is what you want to see. You should see that turn on when you run that command. Okay? With the RBS version for SQL Server 2008 R2, this should happen automatically. You shouldn't have to run this. You shouldn't have to run the reconfigure piece. You'll still have to turn it on, obviously. And then we provision the BLOBstore. So we need to create a BLOBstore, which basically says, provision my master key. So this is the encryption key that's used for the BLOBstore, or used for the communication from the BLOBstore. And we turn that on in the database in which we're working. I mentioned earlier about one of the problems with EBS on 2007 was it was farm scoped. It was everywhere. It was on or it was off. In 2010, we can provision it at database level. So you can have databases attached to a web application with BLOBstore enabled for certain site collections, and ones without it enabled for other site collections for different workloads. So we go into the SQL Server. And again, I'm going to run through this in the demo anyway. We turn it on. We create the key. We then go ahead and provision the actual BLOBstore itself. So the BLOBstore is connected to the SQL Server database through a custom file group. So we provision a new file group. Very straightforward. The file group is of a type, or it's a file stream provider type. And then we add the file. So the file, in this particular instance, we're referring to a location BLOBstore WSS content. BLOBstore can exist at this point. WSS content mustn't exist. If that already exists, you'll have problems. You'll throw an error. But effectively, it's just a hookup. It's saying, turn it on, add me a new file group that's going to be connected to this BLOBstore, and then tell me where the BLOBstore is. That's kind of the story here. And then we'd have to enable it. So when we enable it, we use this mxi exec. And this is what I was saying about don't run this by double-clicking it and just going next, next, next. You have to run it using a set of commands, which effectively the way this works, under the hood, it triggers a whole lot of stored procedures that take place in SQL Server. And it provisions the SQL Server with, or the table, the database that we're enabling it against, with a whole load of new tables. And I'll show you what those tables are when we come down to it. And then once you've enabled it on the first server, on the subsequent servers, it's a slightly different operation. We no longer need to change the database in any way. We just need to tell our SharePoint server where the database is and what database to use for FILESTREAM, to use for BLOBstore, instead of going through the normal SharePoint API to store content in the database. So it's a different operation. And this kind of thing isn't on TechNet. Yeah? If you just look at finding this information on TechNet, it's not there. It just says do this one all the time, which will just cause you no end of trouble. Once we've actually got the thing provisioned and created, our BLOBstore is ready to use, we then have to enable it. So at this point, we've only set the thing up. We have to activate the blob storage capability, the RBS capability, and this is done through PowerShell. So for the web application, at the top here, we get the web application. We get the reference to the remote blob storage settings, and then we have to determine, is it installed? Yes, we've just installed it. We've done that bit already. This bit, true. I've highlighted it in yellow. If you don't see that, you can't go any further. You'll get true or false. One of the big problems we've seen with installation of RBS at this point is that you often return false, even when you've done everything right. And the problem is PowerShell is losing its reference. It's the actual remote blob storage settings are going out of scope. So you just keep returning false. And all you have to do is just hook the thing back up again and rerun the script, and it'll be fine. Don't do what I did the first time I did it and sit there forever running MSI exec to try and make it work. Once you've got your context, you can enable it, and then you just set the provider name to the RBS provider. So it's a very, very simple operation. And then finally, let's just return the object, and we get this. This is what we're looking for down here, this true file store provider. And we'll see these in SQL Server when we look at the demo. And in this particular instance, minimum blob storage size defaults to 0. So everything's going to go in the BLOBstore. Okay, coming back into PowerShell, you can change that and make your own settings, whatever you prefer. And we'll talk about some of the design choices there. So the next steps, I mentioned RBS works at the database level. So what if I add another database to the farm? What then? I can add another server. What if I add a different database? When you add a different database, again, the command changes slightly. We have to run the thing, and we have to activate it. But we don't have to do the whole back-end enable SQL, configure SQL. Yeah, sorry. This doesn't mean a lot. It will mean these are the same SQL commands in the previous slides, but without the, you just do the enable the content DB ones. You don't have to do the enable file stream ones. And then PowerShell to activate provider is, this, again, the same step. So what changes? The key thing that changes, and this is quite a busy slide actually, but one of the key things that change, this is referring to SharePoint 2007 on the left-hand side. In SharePoint 2007, the schema extension was different in the database. So what we actually did was, in the all docs table, there's a field called doc flags, and this is why we're deep dive now, by the way. The doc flags, if the 16th bit of the doc flags table is set, field is set, then what we're saying is we've enabled the external store. For 2010, it's slightly different. We still have the same concept of the 16th bit in the doc flags table, but we have these additional columns. We have this external blob identifier column to the table that is literally a pointer to the identifier of the blob on disk, abstracted slightly. The content itself where you normally expect to see the blob in the content folder, or the content field, sorry, becomes null when we're using external blob. And I'll show you this in the database. It's very obvious to see. So I'll show you now. And if the demo goes really well, this might be a quite short session. Okay, is that visible at the back? I did kind of warn you it's going to be so. Zoom it's not working for some reason on my machine. So what we were looking at before was we've enabled BLOBstore. First thing I want to show you is a database where this thing is actually working, where the whole thing's working end to end. So I've got a database down here which is WSS content. Inside here, we have our doc streams table. And inside here, I'll just query it. I think I can query it over here. Yeah. This is a query against doc streams. So let me just try and get this visualized a bit better. So what we can see in here, we see our usual information. We've got the ID of the object, the site ID where the item is actually being stored. But over here, things change. So what we can see in this particular version is there's actually two blobs here. These were obviously created after or before I enabled the BLOBstore capability. And these were added after I did the BLOBstore capability. So we've got a content which is null instead of a blob, and an RBS ID which points to one of the tables down here, which I always forget, so I'm going to apologize for that. It's one of these down here. And these are the new tables that we get when we enable BLOBstore. So we get a whole list of tables which basically do a number of things. They coordinate where the blobs are on disk. So there's where are my BLOBstores for this content database, for example? Where are my deleted blobs? So when I delete a blob through the BLOBstore, I don't want to go and delete it straight away. There's an aspect of, well, what if I want to recover it? So there's kind of a delay on deletion. And we also store the referential integrity in here. So as the things are propagating through the BLOBstore and we start to push the blob IDs in, information about the whole process is stored in here to enable us to back the whole thing back out again if we decide to back out or veto the operation. And you see across here, here's our RBS ID. Now what's interesting is the RBS ID is actually different to what we see on disk. So when I first started looking at this, I thought, well, here's an RBS ID. And I'm kind of thinking, well, what am I going to get on the file system? I'm going to get a file with that name. That's a bit of a crazy file name. So if I go and look in the file store, I'll go back a bit. So I've configured my BLOBstore, my WSS content, because that's the database I've configured in this case. And what we have in here, we have a log. This log file implements the maintenance side of things that we'll talk about later, so things like flushing and orchestration. Inside here, we have our blobs, based on which database is it coming from, sorry, which web application, which database, which site, etc., etc. So down here, we can see our blobs. So you can see this file is actually, I've got two versions of the same file. It's an 11 meg WMV file as it happens. But you can see it's got this crazy name. And this name is the blob ID interpretation that's then stored on C. The file's not changed, it's just renamed as a new extension, and that is stored in the RBS tables. And then within the RBS tables, and I'm not going to try and find it because I can't remember which one it is, so I apologize for that. Within the RBS table, we then have a link back to our blob RBS ID that's in the content DB. So there's kind of a two-step lookup to find the thing. It's not straight to doc streams and then straight to disk. It's a double hop. So, having said that, I'm now going to try the thing that may or may not work. So when I told people I was going to demo this live, they thought I was mad, but we'll see. Okay, so we're going to do a new install. What I've got here is a WSS Content 81. It's a new database. It's on a different web application. So if I just, before we go here, I'll just show you the web application. So this is the original, and here. So that's the original showing my video file that I loaded before. And here's my home new one. Just refresh that, which has no content in. It's a completely empty web application, and it's hosted on port 81, hence the content 81 just let this warm up a little bit before it gets going. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and enable BLOBstore capability for this database on this web application. What I won't be doing is running that very first MSI exec command, because we don't need to. The SQL Server is already provisioned. The SharePoint farm's already enabled for that. But I do need to enable the database. Hopefully. Okay, well, while it's revving up, we'll go back to SQL. So inside SQL, we have our commands that we need to run. So this one I don't need to run this time, because this is the one that just enables FileStream on the server instance itself. But I do need to run these ones. So these are the ones that provision the database itself, or provision the capability for WSS Content 81 in this case, to have its encryption key, to have its BLOBstore, its additional file group, and also then hook the file group up to the file store. So this has not been tested, because once you turn it on, there's no way of backing it out. So we'll see if it works. So I'll run them one at a time rather than do it all together. So we're fine with that one. So in this case, we've now got our key. If I now add the file group, that's fine as well. And just before we go there, I'll show you the properties on here. What we'll see in here now, hopefully, is this new FileStream provider. That's what that last command did. It added that file group in there. And then the very last command itself will hook up the FileStream provider with the file, which in this case we're saying is, like that, is BLOBstore WSS Content 81. So it's the file location for the blobs. And we're done. So that's pretty much all we need to do in SQL Server at this time. But we've got one other thing to do, is that's to go to the SharePoint server and run the MSI exec that says, okay, you've already have BLOBstore enabled for the first database, but now you're adding a new one. Sorry, I'm going all over the place here. If you haven't noticed in any other demos this week, I can't use keypads on laptops. And that's to run this command. So this command is add the capability to another database. Okay, another database, different web application. We need to enable it on here. So just make sure I've got all the settings right. So it's WSS Content 81 in the same SQL Server instance. So that'll run in the background, and you kind of sit and wonder what's happening, whether it's going to finish or not. It's fairly quick. The first time you run it, when you're provisioning a new machine or a new system with Run RBS, it's quite slow, and it can take several minutes before it actually completes. I'll just check this one is finished. Yeah, so we're done. It spawns a second instance of MSI exec that runs quite high CPU, so you'll know when it's done. So we're finished at this point in time. So the next thing we need to do is do the PowerShell piece. So inside PowerShell, I'm going to run these same commands here, but I'm going to run them against the different web application. I'm going to try and cheat a little. So hook up to get the content database. Oh, the other thing is, if you are using a web application that has more than one content database associated with it, you need to do one further step here, because this returns just the content, because there's only one, it just returns one content DB. Nice and easy. If you've got multiple content DBs, you end up returning a multiple property. So you've got to then select which content DB you want to implement it on. So that's done. So we'll get the remote blob storage settings for that. And we'll do install. And this is where things may or may not work. Okay, so we're good. So we've installed it. We've confirmed that RBS is installed for this content database. That's what that step's actually doing. The next thing we need to do is turn it on. So it's enabled, and then we'll just get the context again to make sure we get the final piece back. So we can see here, again, sorry it's a bit small, but we can see that it's true. Enabled is true. Minimum blob storage size is 0 again. And we've, well, the other thing is, from an upgrade perspective, the aspects of, once you turn BLOBstore on, it will tell you some information about whether the database requires, not requires upgrading the concept of a DB upgrade, but you get information about the database in terms of its other properties. In this case, it's an upgrade property. So we're fine at this point. I can go into the web app. If we look at our file store on the SQL server rather than on the SharePoint server, we will see where's my BLOBstore gone? Oh, look at the wrong machine, Neil. Sorry guys, I've been an idiot. So in our BLOBstore, we can see we've now got the new folder. Okay, so it's WSS Content 81. At the moment, there's nothing in it. Well, there better not be anything in it. Well, it's an empty file. It's a placeholder. If I now go in here and upload a file, so the plan was that this demo would break. And we could talk a bit more about why it breaks and how it breaks and things you need to be aware of. So, as a consequence, we'll see how long the session takes to finish. We're half an hour in, so we're doing okay. Plenty more slides yet. So I'll just grab something. Content. Let's find that. I'll grab that same video we had before. So this is now going through the process of that whole flow process, but it's, instead of SharePoint talking to the database to pass the file to the database, all we're getting is the file is going direct to the file store, the BLOBstore, and the database will just have an ID in it. So let's go and find that ID. In fact, so inside our 81, we should now have we don't have a file. Let's just check. I did put that on the right web app, didn't I? Let's check the database. That's the easy way. Okay, so something's gone wrong. We'll try and see if we can work out what it is. So if I go to my docstreams table and just do a select all, let's get all the rows. In here, I was expecting this to be the other way around, like we saw with the first one. So we've clearly had a problem. No, go back. Did I? So who spotted that when I did it? Help. So you let me take a fall. Thank you very much, guys. That's great. Much appreciated. So I didn't, what did I not do? I didn't do the provider. I did that bit. Yeah, enable. Set active provider. That's what happens when you use back to try and work things out. That one. Let's just enable it again to make sure it's done. I thought I did that. Okay. So what did I miss? Okay. Live troubleshooting. Which step did I miss? I think I got that one. I missed that one. Yeah, okay, so we've done it now anyway. So we're on. Okay, so I have an active provider name. Thank you. So any applause? If I get any at the end of this session, now it goes to this guy down here. Okay, so back to SQL, back to the SharePoint. I'll go and reinstall, I'll go and upload a new document. And we should, hopefully, have some success. If I'm in the right place. I did say don't use it on central admin or admin content DB. So let's do this one again. So I'll do a different file, find something that's reasonably large, 6 meg. So they did tell me I was mad for demoing this live, but there you go. And we'll just rerun this script query. And it still doesn't look good. Oh no, there we go. So it's worked. Thank you for your help. Classroom troubleshooting. That's for him, not for me. So we can see we've enabled it, we've turned it on, and it's actually working. So we're getting our reference out there, and we should now, hopefully see craziness of remote desktop. Get rid of that. We should hopefully see on our file system in the right place our file. Okay, so it's worked. So we're operational. Very, very simple to implement. He says, on 2008, it's working extremely well. The steps may change slightly on 2008 R2, so just be aware of that. It does work fine on 2008, but from a support standpoint, 2008 R2 is where you want to be. Okay. I think that was what I was going to show you. Okay, so any questions on that? No. Okay, so what we need to think about then is, well, what are the good reasons why we'd want to use BLOBstore? This is where the design decisions come in. Why we're going to encourage our customers to use it or not, as the case may be. And this is a little bit of a marketing slide, but I guess thinking about things like expense. So expense is a key one for SQL Server. SQL Server storage is not cheap. SQL Server storage on with fast I/O, or that requires fast I/O, is an expensive operation. Using RAID 10, you're going to talk about SQL, talk to Mike significantly. He's probably one of the world's experts. You're going to get a lot of expense to configure high-performance SQL systems. This allows us to use less expensive commodity storage almost. Obviously, you still want to use something that's going to deliver your blobs at a reasonable speed, but it's no longer the same kind of SQL Server, high I/O, massive IOPS that we look for in SQL Server and SharePoint implementations. So the whole concept of capital expense and operational expense. So from an operational perspective, we can host these things on almost like hosting them on file servers. Maintenance of a file server is significantly cheaper and simpler than maintenance of a SQL server. Okay, you generally pay the people less probably as well. So it's a simpler operation. You can even get people to do it themselves rather than have to have highly paid DBAs. From a DR perspective, we can look at doing optional, we can opt in, opt out of DR strategies. So depending on how you do your backup, whether it's used from a SharePoint perspective, whether it's using SharePoint tooling, whether it's using native SQL tooling, whether it's using some custom tooling, you have a lot of vast range of flexibility about how and where you do your backups. You can do them independently of the BLOBstore and the SQL Server database, or you can do them together. And one of the key things, I guess, is this concept of advanced data storage features. So BLOBstore vendors, the one we just looked at there is the Microsoft one. Very, very simple. Stores the data local to SQL. It works. Probably not the most performant system. You wouldn't necessarily want to use that in a high-end production system. You'd want to use something where you can have a lot more control, a lot more dictation over where the data is going to go and how performant the provider is going to be. Because you've got two more layers of complexity in there, the client API and the server API. You need to make sure that that is optimal. And there's various vendors that can provide that for you. Like I said, there's a couple of vendors outside the door there that are offering this capability, and there's a whole range more. I did have a slide with a list on, but I didn't want to offend anybody by missing one out. And then in terms of hierarchical storage management, so the whole thing end-to-end really gives us this concept of efficient management. It's an easier, simpler way to maintain our data. Like I said, we don't get these huge footprints in SQL Server databases anymore. We don't have the SQL storage requirements that we had anymore. It's a whole end-to-end cost saving in both operational and capital expense. Right, marketing's gone. So when should I use it with SharePoint? So let's consider the situation probably a lot of us are going to be in where we're thinking about upgrading our clients. Most people won't go around the simple one-click in-place upgrade scenario. But if you did, so let's say you've got a small operation running Foundation server, for example, running WSS3. You want to upgrade into Foundation. It could even be a development environment. You want to do an upgrade. You want to test an upgrade. So one of the problems we have now with 2010 is that we don't ship the Windows internal database with 2010. You get SQL Express 2008. SQL Express 2008 has database limitations of 4 gig per DB that the Windows internal database didn't have. So what happens if I'm already above that limit and I want to upgrade my environment? I've got 16 gigs worth of data and I need to upgrade it. What happens is if you do the single install, we will automatically take that data and push it out into RBS for you. We'll configure the local file stream and we'll configure it all for you. And that will just happen seamlessly, well, hopefully. Most people wouldn't go down that route. So if you've got a whole amount of data, what we're saying here is that you would do it differently. So you start to look at things like, well, how do I migrate my data? How do I move things around, make it so my data that's currently in all my SharePoint databases is pushed out onto my file store? So the recommendations that we're talking about, this is data that it's about 4 weeks old, this recommendation, but obviously, whatever point in time you're doing this, get the latest information. So we're looking at a recommendation of around about 1 terabyte as being the break point between SQL storage and file server storage. And that's going to be different for almost every single client that you work with. Some clients I've worked with are nowhere near a terabyte of storage anyway, significantly nowhere near. And this whole kind of concept of research and planning. Talk to your providers, the provider of the blob storage implementation, talk to the customer, how much can they spend, what optimized performance do they need. There's a whole consultancy discussion that has to go on there, such as you would do with any upgrade anyway. So how do I move it? So I've got this large implementation, I've got my 10 terabytes of data, and I want to push this data now out of my databases and push it down to a BLOBstore. Okay? We use this command called migrate. So it's a PowerShell command. It's very, very simple. When you run it, it just simply takes the blobs where they are in the database and just pushes them out to the BLOBstore. It's just a kind of straight on off it goes. It does a copy of the blobs one at a time. So there's no kind of concept of multiple copies. It's one. So it's could be quite a slow operation. But it is a live migration, more importantly. And that's probably more important than the performance. The fact is, when you do it, the system's live. Okay? So you might get one minor interruption where it's making the changeover between deleting the blob and bringing on the BLOBstore online for that one item. But generally, the whole concept end-to-end is an online system where you're migrating data. Something that we really struggle with in many SharePoint implementations of migration, where you tend to say, okay, make this whole thing read-only while you move everything over to this other service. You can also turn it on and off. So when you're running the command shell, or the commandlet, if you decide it's going too slow, you need to do something else, you want to stop it and think about it again, even go back, which we'll come on to in a minute, you can just kill it dead. So it could be there waiting to push another 10,000 blobs out to the file store and you've only got halfway through it, you can stop it. And you can restart it. It's very, very intelligent that way. And the other thing we can do is what's called back migration. So we can push things back in. And we'll show you the commands for this in a minute, but we can do a migration where we say migrate one way onto file store, and then if we want to say, okay, we want to change our provider. We've tried the SQL one. We know it works. We now want to go to a more performant vendor-provided API or vendor-provided system. We can do back migration, so we can push everything back in again, change provider, and then push it all back out again. So it's kind of this continuous cycle of switching backwards and forwards. The other thing you can do is upgrade from EBS to RBS. So if you've got a system that's using the old external blob storage system that we're now not supporting but not recommending anymore, you can go back the other way. So you can go from EBS to RBS using the migration capability. And it's very, very simple. Three lines. Discover the site or web application. Pick up the remote blob storage settings for that particular database and then migrate. So as long as that database is configured for RBS, the migrate command will just pick up the provider and just start pumping out the content one by one. And we can go backwards. So we can, as well as externalizing, we can internalize. So this is where if we wanted to change our provider, we could go back into the database, bearing in mind there's a potential for a huge impact on SQL Server when you're doing this, because you're suddenly going to go and start storing everything back in SQL again. So don't try and, if you've been externalizing for a long time and you've got terabytes of data on the file system, you're going to need terabytes of data on the SQL Server system on a database by database basis, so it can be managed. And then the final thing, once you've internalized, is to disable it. So you just disable the remote blob storage. Because if you run this command and don't disable, you'll just continue, for new content, will continue to go out to the BLOBstore again. I mentioned something called the maintenance, and how do we maintain the data that's in the BLOBstore. And the RBS maintainer is a download that will come with the RBS SQL Server 2008 R2 provider. And it's a command, it's a tool. It's a tooling that's provided. And what it actually does is, it will allow us to use the concept of garbage collection. So when I mentioned before about when you delete things from the BLOBstore, or you delete things in SharePoint via the BLOBstore, they don't necessarily get deleted straight away. References are maintained, so the data is maintained for a certain period of time, so you can go back, you can recover the information. What this does is it does the garbage collection piece. So garbage collection and maintenance tasks, both maintenance tasks from a SQL Server perspective, but from a cleanup perspective as well. If you have the potential for orphans where you might have deleted something on the file system accidentally, which is incredibly difficult to do anyway, it will detect it in here. It will report that there's a problem. It will fix the problem if you've got the concept of orphans. And it's a simple task. You just schedule it to run periodically. I can't show it you because I don't have it. It's available somewhere, but not to me, unfortunately. But it's very, very straightforward. It's a simple provider that just does this maintenance, and you just set the tool up, you schedule it to run, much like you would with any SQL Server maintenance plan. It's the same kind of approach. And from the retention policy, acceptable retention policy for blobs, we can basically specify you've deleted a blob, keep it in or keep it on the BLOBstore for a certain period of time with a link inside those RBS tables I showed you, which is the deleted blobs table, and you can specify how long that's maintained. I think it can be as low as instant, delete it straight away, or keep it forever. So how does backup and restore work in this scenario? When we're doing simple backup and restore of SharePoint databases, content databases, you can do SharePoint to back it up. Sorry. You can do SQL Server backup, you can do SharePoint backup, you can do custom tool backup, vendor-provided backup. With RBS, we have a kind of an order of operations. Now, the order of operations is pretty much vendor, provider, tooling agnostic. We don't care. What we're saying is just do it this way, whichever way you do it. So when you're going to start the backup, what we're saying is basically you start the backup through SQL, get your SQL Server backed up or moving through SQL Server backup, and then back up the BLOBstore. Okay? When you're doing the restore, do it the other way around. The reason being, mainly for this, is because while you're backing up this, you might still be pushing data down into here. So you want to make sure that your BLOBstore is fully integral by the time you come back to the SQL Server. We have tools to fix SQL Server often, so we can fix that if there's a scenario where we go the other way around. But if we end up with a BLOBstore that's backed up before SQL, you could end up with a scenario where you've got references in the SQL Server that aren't available on the BLOBstore anymore. So your backup goes out of sync. And when we're going back the other way, I said restore the BLOBstore and then restore your SQL Server. So that way you maintain the integrity. And it's, like I say, it's vendor agnostic. Depends whether you're using SharePoint, any third-party tooling, or even SQL Server tooling. So I guess coming to the final things is more about these decisions about what we do and what's the performance impact of RBS. Do we gain anything by using RBS, and why do we use it? One of the key things is there's little to no overhead, and it is tiny. There is obviously more complexity. There's more pieces in the puzzle. But in terms of the actual performance impact, it's virtually negligible. In fact, in some instances, it's improved. What we find is this is a snapshot that came, a little bit of data that came out of the SQL Server CAT team. This is an internal Microsoft team for customer advisory team for SQL Server related issues. And looking at different file sizes with a very, very simple, very small population. The key thing that was the main thing we're seeing is as the file size increases, so look at the bottom line mainly, the file size increases, we're seeing significant performance improvements from SQL Server CPU usage. So that means you can get more bang for your buck in terms of CPU on SQL servers. Again, not an insignificant cost. But generally, in terms of the response time, albeit larger files, so you'd expect the response time to increase with a larger file size, we're not seeing anything that's significantly degraded when we turn the blob storage APIs on or off. And in terms of requests per second, on or off, again, very little difference. So we're getting significantly, in fact, the last one's actually improved throughput with larger files. And that's borne out. We're looking at 5 to 10% degradation of overall throughput, which is not a huge amount, considering the capital and the operational expense that you're going to save by implementing this capability. And the throughput is actually getting better as you go larger. So there's a trade-off of file size. The average response time, we're saying, is minimal. As the file size increases, the response time gets closer and closer to what you'd expect from a normal SharePoint implementation. It's very, very close to the default SharePoint implementation. But the CPU usage is huge. We're getting significantly reduced CPU usage, as I said already, at the larger file size level. And if we take that one step further, just to look at a comparison of the database and the file system, you can probably read that from the back. The database throughput in terms of megabits per second against the file system, you're getting significantly improved database levels with 256K files, so the throughput's much higher with smaller files, reasonably higher. But as you go this way, we reach a point where we converge. 1 megabyte file. And this is obviously on one implementation of an RBS. So beyond 1 megabyte, we start to see significant performance improvement by using the file system versus using SQL Server. And you can obviously tune that. You start looking at SQL Server chunk sizes and all kinds of things like that to improve the way that performance works. But generally going direct to disk, direct to file system, beyond 1 megabyte file size is a significant performance improvement. So we'll mention about supportability. For RBS 2008, from SQL Server 2008, we don't support it. But it works, you've just seen it. Okay? So you can test it, you can play with it today. But in terms of gaining support from Microsoft, if you want to raise a PSS call, you're going to get minimal traction. And if you try and use the RBS 2008 provider on SQL Server 2008 R2, again, it's the same scenario. It will work, but you're not supported. The RBS R2 with FileStream provider on SQL Server 2008 or on SQL Server 2008 R2 is both supported, and in the case of SQL Server 2008 R2 is actually the recommended approach. So what we're saying is, which would probably make sense, if you're deploying SQL Server R2, then use the R2 provider. Okay, it's the recommended approach. The download will be available with the release of SQL Server 2008 R2, so the whole new provider will come available as soon as SQL Server R2. I think it might even be available with a CTP. I'm not entirely sure. But we were originally saying we would align the RTM date with SharePoint. I don't know if that's happened, but we're very, very close to RTM if we're any but days or weeks away. And then finally, SharePoint with RBS requires SQL Server Enterprise Edition. I'm not entirely sure that's true, but I will follow up on that and try and get some information to Steve. I wanted to leave it in here because that's a statement from the SQL Server product group. Okay, that's not my statement, so I wanted to leave it in. I'm trying to confirm its accuracy. If you email me, if you really need to know this data without waiting for it to be publicly available, email me directly and I'll get the answer for you directly. Okay. But we say in the previous statement that we work it on Express Edition as part of an upgrade, so it doesn't make too much sense to me, but we'll cover that off and get an answer for you on that one. And that's me done. Apart from the slight glitch in the demo, I was expecting more problems, but other than that, we're kind of done. So if there's any Q&A, anyone got any questions? I think we're probably 5 minutes short. That's not too bad. Any Q&A? Mike, thank you.
Can you use the FileStream provider from SQL to store blobs off the system, off the server?
No, not the FileStream provider, not the FileStream and RBS provider that Microsoft provide, no. You need a third-party vendor tooling to do that.
You mentioned the use of SAN is not supported. Is that the case even if those SAN disks are presented to the SQL Server?
So the question is SanDisk not supported? SanDisks are supported, but the Microsoft system, you shouldn't use the Microsoft FileStream provider with SanDisks. you should be using a third-party vendor for that.
And that's even if they're presented to the SQL Server?
Yes, they need to be local disk. Yeah, it won't, when you try and configure it, it doesn't work.
You mentioned that you can set in business logic to decide whether or not to save stuff out of RBS and keep it on
Yep.
content databases. Can you configure that to be based on things like what site collection the content belongs to or what content type?
No, the granularity is purely file size and content database. So it's what file size per content DB. So did anyone hear the question? The question was about the granularity of the setting for deciding whether we go to BLOBstore or SQL. No more? Thank you for coming. Oh, another one, Mike.
Neil, so what options do we have to modify the file stream provider to essentially make that business logic work? Or is it even the file stream provider we're worried about?
So the setting.
For example, I want to make sure that my ASPX files that end up unghosted stay in the database versus to the file stream.
So it only works for it will not do ASPX files. It only does files that are uploaded to document libraries. ASPX file upload now is blocked. Okay, you can't upload an ASPX file directly to a library. So it works for library implementation, and the only options you have are via the PowerShell provisioning of the PowerShell settings on the provider API. You can basically say files of this size, and it's configured on a per content DB. So it's very inflexible in terms of that approach. But from an ASPX file perspective, it's not a concern because ASPX files can't be uploaded anyway. Okay.
In terms of larger files, does this help us at all with the limits of what SharePoint is able to upload? Say you've got a very large video file.
I was wondering when that question was coming. So the question was about how can we, or does it help us with the aspects of SharePoint that say we can only upload or download 2 gig maximum file sizes? And the answer to that question is no. And that's not a SharePoint limitation, that's an IIS limitation. So the IIS has a maximum throughput of 2 gig file size, and we're still stuck with that. You could do something which would go off box and use a direct SM, maybe tell the client to go direct to the file rather than go through IIS, but you'd have to customize and write that separately. Sorry.
You said in SharePoint Foundation, there's a limit of 4 gigabyte. Is that for the site collection? There's the limit of
Right. Just wind that one back a little bit.
Yeah.
There was, sorry, for
You said for the SharePoint Foundation, you were saying there's a limit, like before in WSS, if we were doing internal database, there was not much of a limit. But now in SharePoint Foundation, there's a limit of 4 GB, which is using the SharePoint Express.
Okay, so maybe I didn't explain that quite clearly, but the question was around the limitations of the database sizes between the Windows internal database that we shipped with WSS 3 and SQL Server Express 2008 that ships with SharePoint Foundation or with SharePoint Server. The limit is a SQL Server limit, and Windows internal DB, a bit like, remember the old MSDE database? That had a 4 gig limit. When you deployed the SharePoint version of that DB, your database sizes was unlimited. With SQL Express, we're back in a scenario where we have a limited database size. So SQL Server 2008 Express only supports a maximum database size of 4 gig. So if your database is bigger than 4 gig, coming out of SharePoint 2007, we will implement RBS for you. In fact, I think we do it anyway, regardless of whether it's bigger or not. We just implement RBS. I'd have to check that. But so RBS becomes implemented to allow you to maintain the size of your database, but split between BLOBstore and database itself. So hopefully the database will shrink below 4 gig. If it doesn't, you've then got another problem. But, okay.
You mentioned it only works with document libraries. I just want to clarify that. If I have attachments on other list items, different types of libraries, it won't work with those.
That's a really good question. We'll take that offline, and if you want, we'll test it. If you can spare 5 minutes of your lunch, we'll try it. Any other questions before we?
Just to sort of confirm, you were saying that the only criteria you've got to control the actual filter for upload is file size. So you can't actually capture file type, different extensions. It's only on the file size.
It's file size, yeah. From our implementation. With the third-party implementation, the world's your oyster. You can do what you like. You can write your own.
You're right. The BLOBstore has to be local to SQL Server. If you've got clustered SQL using clustered shared volumes,
So the question was, can we store, if the C drive is mounted to a clustered shared volume, like the SQL Server 2008 type implementation of clustered shared volumes? I'm not sure entirely. All the requirements of the SharePoint, sorry, the requirements of the FileStream provider and RBS provider from Microsoft must be local disk. It doesn't give us any implementation about whether that's if you're doing that particular scenario, whether it's going to work or not. But again, I can try and get that information for you for sure. Okay. So I'm going to try the list attachment thing if anyone's interested in seeing it and losing a couple of minutes of your dinner. Thank you.